Our age of history is about to end. The world that you and I have spent our entire lives in, upon which we've built our assumptions about how the world works, will end shockingly and markedly in the near future. This will be a deeply traumatic process that will affect everyone on the planet and will, in its turmoil, set the stage for what the future will look like. In previous videos, I've talked about how, from looking at the historic record, it seems very plausible that the world order collapses, and in videos like this, I've gone through the underlying logic that propels it. This will be a video to talk about how it could possibly play out in details, while going through the various interconnected factors that could contribute to it. If you're a viewer of this channel, I suspect you spend a lot of time thinking about the future and potential conflicts that could arise. Yet many of us won't be able to lead the upcoming wars and define the future as perhaps we'd like. For anyone looking to see your nation through a war and into a glorious future, Conflict of Nations is for you. Conflict of Nations is an online real-time strategy game that lets you play as a nation in the modern world and vie for domination against up to 128 opponents. Experience warfare and define history right from your PC or phone, manage troops and resources against your enemies, and carve out a place in the sun for your empire. With wars that can last days or even weeks, Conflict of Nations can be an intense game that's super fun and engaging. The game features a wide variety of units from tanks and trucks to nuclear submarines and jet fighters, so if you're into warfare, strategy games, or world domination, this is a game for you. Right now, Conflict of Nations is offering anyone using the link below 13,000 gold and 1 month premium subscription for free. The offer is only available for 30 days, so don't lose time, join the fight in Conflict of Nations. Most people agree today that the international order is fundamentally unstable, that the trajectory is built on foundations that are no longer operational, and the results of which we must see bear fruit. However, most people don't understand why this is happening on a beyond intuitive basis. The overarching answer is something I've covered before on this YouTube channel on a really frequent basis, so much so that I shudder to bring it up again. For more details, this is a video I made explicitly about this topic. However, you see these historic crashes every few centuries or so that are driven by demographic and economic factors, largely relating to inequality and overcompetition for labor, which results in social collapses. The last clear example of this in the Western world being the French Revolution, and before that the crisis of the 17th century, which some historians think killed a third of the world's population, and before that the Black Death. But you find examples like this going back into the ancient world. Interestingly enough, there are a series of variables you can use to predict crises like this, including stuff like inequality, wage stagnation, rising real estate costs, the average age of marriage, moving beyond a certain range, and the like. The epic historian Peter Turchin has made computer models that predict crises like the French Revolution, the fall of the Roman Republic, and the like, on the timescales they actually happened at. His computer said in around 2010 that America, and realistically much of the world by extension, would have a massive social crash in the 2020s. A really horrifying thing to keep in mind is that in almost all these crashes, you see combinations of external and internal wars, like the French Revolution with the Napoleonic Wars or World War I and the Russian Civil War. The normal result is that one faction of the elite kills the other, since competition inside the countries becomes so great, something that people seem to be working themselves towards in the modern world. Well, there's also major wars and plagues, sadly. These problems normally last a couple decades, like with the crises of the medieval and early modern periods taking around 50 years, while the crisis that came with the Napoleonic Wars lasted at least 20. However, something to consider is that if we're going to trust the Turchin data, the United States and China at even half the speed of the US moved through this last cycle at twice the speed of the previous cycles you'd see in pre-industrial European history. Thus, I really don't know how long this kind of crisis would take, anywhere from a decade upwards. There's another interesting historian named Goldstein who is in this kind of work, who wrote what I consider to be the unreadable book of long cycles, in which he found that major wars occurred with shocking clockwork across Western history. Also, writing in the 1970s, found a series of variables built up economics that predicted that there would be a major conflict in the world order between the US and China in the year 2020. Interestingly enough, from my own observation, at the start of every century there's a major land-based aggressor to the balance of power, which is countered by a sea-based power which constructs an international alliance against them and defeats the land-based aggressor power. This sounds like a perfect description of US-Chinese relations today and how a war between them would likely play out. Thus, we know from the historic precedent that the world order could collapse very easily, but what are the current factors that could make this play out? How would some fancy crisis like this manifest in our real lives? There are several key triggers built inside the world system that, if pushed, would result in the collapse of the world order. Let's work through them. The first is the global financial system, which I made a video about here. This is the era of the highest money printing ever in world history. As a note, whenever we've got money printing this high historically, it always results in a social collapse. I'm not talking about a recession here, I'm talking about wars and rebellions around the world. Then on top of that, compare by how much more the current money printing crisis is compared to any other era in history. The key problem here is that due to inequality, most young folks are barely getting by as is. And so if the standard of living is lowered even further, it'll breed further radicalism, dissent, and collapse. Just look at the events like January 6th or the Chaz rebellions, and then imagine that magnified across the globe. The horrifying thing is that it looks like the elite is totally disconnected from the real population, as we've seen through many countries' different COVID policies. I mean, the Biden administration literally said it would respond to inflation by printing more money. I think we'll look forward to stagflation, or high unemployment and high inflation, a really bad combination for economists and governments, since responding to one of those basically makes the other one worse. I can make this sound like a purely American problem, which it really isn't. Most governments around the world are printing money at very high rates, and in China the problem is by far the worst of anywhere in the world. This degree of money printing has negative effects on all of society, but these are made most manifest in China. For example, inflation tends to result in housing prices going through the roof, since people invest in real physical assets that don't lose value like the money does. However, this has resulted in China having some of the highest home-to-wage cost ratios of anywhere in the world, leaving the average Chinese person with no chance of basically supporting a family or moving into a comfortable middle age. At the same time, economic crashes tend to hit the third world very hard, given that they're often very dependent upon wealthier markets for exports or capital. Thus, it wouldn't surprise me if an economic crash, starting in China or the US, would promulgate state collapses and collapses in order in the third world. As an update to the video I released on why I thought we'd have an economic crash a year ago, in many ways it's become common knowledge among people in the know, where many people just assume the market will crash now. As an example of this, I'm sure some of you have seen the famous update from tech startup accelerator Y Combinator telling their startups to basically prepare for the end times. I could have told you all of that stuff before, but the Ukraine war has further pushed this inevitable crisis forward, promulgating a couple sticking points that will tear the world system apart. The biggest and scariest is food. This is something that Peter Zeihan, who is one of the most respected people in the geopolitics industry, has been saying for a long time, but I really didn't believe him until I started to see what happened in the aftermath of the Ukraine war. I thought this is the era of the highest agricultural productivity ever by a vast margin, in which there are nearly 3 times as many fat people in the world as hungry. It's impossible for places to starve. Well, one of the things I've realized living life is that God is often cruel, but he always has a sense of humor. If the data is correct, we might see the largest famine in history in the next 10 years or so. The thing is that Russia and Ukraine are some of the biggest grain exporters in the world, and much of Africa and the Middle East, or the top food importing areas in the world, are totally dependent upon them. Both Russia and Ukraine have stopped exporting grain due to the war. Much of the third world is operating on grain reserves that won't hold until the winter, in which there is basically no one to export grain to. One of the biggest factors that's getting very little attention is that the nitrogen and fertilizer network, of which Russia and Ukraine are truly massive linchpins, alongside with supply problems in Canada, mean that much of the third world won't be getting fertilizer this year. This might not sound like a big deal to most normal people, but it's honestly the biggest deal in the world. The reason that the world's population is 4 times what it was during World War II, but we're all better fed, was due to the massive rises in agricultural productivity since then, concentrated in third world countries. Just Africa has seen a 5 times over growth in population as an example. At the same time, lots of these third world countries have poor supply networks, which means that if one bolt falls loose, farmers won't even be able to get the fertilizer by truck anyway, thus meaning that the crops people depend on won't be grown at all. At the same time, the other main agricultural powers are having problems. The United States, one of the world's agricultural juggernauts, is seeing its own supply problems that will make this harvest really depressed. The supply chain just isn't operating properly to see proper agricultural outputs that you would need. At the same time, this has been a really terrible harvest in the upper Midwest, where American agriculture is concentrated. The US won't starve. It's a massive food exporter, and so it'll just keep selling food abroad. But this would in turn have horrible and deleterious effects in the rest of the world, which is dependent upon American grain. Meanwhile, if you look at Latin America, where the other agricultural titans like Argentina and Brazil reside, we see similar problems where the modern anti-agricultural parties are making it very difficult for those nations to expand agricultural production abilities, thus making them unable to fill the gap in global agriculture. Of all the problems here, food is the one I'm least certain of. If the war in Ukraine stops soon and we return to a peaceful world, it seems possible to patch everything up. Also, it does seem possible that the Americans could just make up the slack as the price of global food goes up, just not to dangerous levels. I think these worries could be overhyped. However, a point you can't fail to emphasize is that if this does go wrong, it will go wrong by this winter, meaning we have less than 6 months where the world would go to shit. A major pressure point connected to this is oil. The modern oil market is possibly the best orchestrated thing in the world, spanning continents and oceans, operating at remarkably low costs. However, it's very easy to disturb. Just look at how the Russia and Ukraine war was able to result in doubling the price of international oil. However, if we're adding in massive food problems in the Middle East, one of the largest food importers in the world, upon which the old world is dependent on oil from, we'd see mass shutdowns of oil production in the area, which would further skyrocket the price of oil. This would hurt East Asians disproportionately, the area of the world most dependent upon foreign oil. However, oil is so integral to the global economy that to raise its price by a large margin would result in massive, untold global implications and problems. Which brings us to a grim piece in this puzzle, China. Talked about in this video, China really doesn't look like it's in a good position. Like, I think everyone in the world, and I'm betting even the Communist Party here, I honestly don't have a good understanding of what's going on in China right now. However, after 2 months of brutal lockdowns driven by a desire to suck up to Xi, to summarize in bullet points, Xi has built his honor off defeating COVID, and yet he is opposed by various internal factions in China, and thus has been pushing really horrible lockdown policies to show his power and cower his opponents. This has resulted in a nasty and messy process in which the rules get enforced on different local bases, which has resulted in things as horrifying as Chinese farmers not seeing their next harvests, thus opening China up for starving next year, cities shutting down brutally, provinces cutting each other off totally from interprovincial trade, effectively stranding China into thousands of little regions. Brutality in many areas is the norm, whether people starving during COVID lockdowns, being willed into their apartments, and the like. They are literally doing everything they would be doing if they wanted to establish a horrifying, militaristic, totalitarian state. They've shut off Chinese from visiting foreign countries, they've banned studying foreign languages, they're stockpiling food and oil and raw materials, they're massing an army to attack Taiwan, they are posting extremely aggressive nationalist propaganda and saying in their party mouthpiece newspapers they want to have a war with America. A reason China is being so aggressive is its aging crisis. This is again something I've talked about ad nauseum before in previous videos, but the world's aging crisis is about to profoundly start disturbing nations. The world's population in many countries is about to halve over the next 60 years, including China, Russia, Germany, or Japan. If we look at the effects of what these sort of things have already happened in Japan, the oldest country in the world, we're looking at how Japan went from being the most innovative country in the world to having seen basically no economic growth for 30 years. Meanwhile, look at the poor countries that stand with no ability to support their elderly, and thus would have cascading effects of a gray wave that would destroy their societies, with decreased ability for the young to make businesses, have kids, and the like, which would just make the problem worse. In places like China or Russia, this will destroy their governments, which is why they're being so aggressive now. This brings you to the final point here, that all of this adds up to geopolitical instability that acts as a factor in of itself. I've talked about it so many times on this show before, while at the same time it's so complicated that it's difficult for me to talk about. However, the world is filled with aggressive, unstable powers that look to expand outwards as a way of justifying their existences. There are two arcs of instability to keep track of in the future. The first roughly corresponds to the former Mongol Empire, but is really the sphere of the Russian-Chinese alliance against the rest of the world. On every edge of this sphere is a potential hotspot that could result in a major war between the great powers. Examples include Ukraine, Syria, Iran, North Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and the like. I have no idea which of these could possibly trigger the fire. The second arc of instability is the area with food and water instability if things go bad, which stretches from Africa into Central Asia. This is a region that will just go insane and fall apart if the world goes to shit, since they can't feed their own people. Between these two separate arcs, the area where the collapse of the world is most likely to start is the Middle East, which is the easy answer, and is to our modern world system what the Balkans were to World War I, an unstable area of ethnic tension that the great powers were involved in with local alliances. It's hard to predict a real path for what could possibly happen. As I've said time and time again on this YouTube channel, my job is basically betting against God, so the chances of anything I could possibly tell you happening is pretty low, but this is a scenario that I think is pretty possible. And I mean, we've gotten predictions both right and wrong on this channel, so we'll just have to see what happens. I think it's pretty plausible we see a financial crash this summer. The American and Chinese economies are so intertwined they'd collapse in pretty close unison with the other. Maybe the Chinese government would try to play some sort of trick to try to go back to Maoist times, where recessions don't matter, but that would just result in a revolution. However, as stated before, this would also result in a worldwide recession, with stagflation or a nasty combination of rapid inflation and high unemployment, and thus we would see a collapse in real living wages. The US dollar, which has been artificially propped up by foreign governments, would show the true value that it is after all the money printing that's happening, thus resulting in horrible results for the standard of living of the American people. The reason I'm putting this summer as a potential point for this crash to happen is because if we're starting with the assumption that there'd be mass famine and state collapse in the third world by the time we hit the fall, stuff like that doesn't normally just immediately happen out of the blue, and there's normally a series of events that presage or foreshadow it, or ramping up of worse and worse events. And so it makes sense if you see state collapse after a financial crash that would happen the summer before. With all this going on, Saudi Arabia or Iran collapse in a revolution. The other country now tries to intervene in the other country's political crisis, thus creating extra drama in the Middle East, which, since we're talking about the Middle East here, becomes basically impossible to predict because there's like 30 factions that all hate each other. China does something big at this point. I'd posit around November when they're going to start having food problems. Basically, they either invade Taiwan or fall in a revolution. What either of these happens is hard to say, but here are some videos in which I go into more of the details. If there is a war between China and India or the US, it would be the greatest conflict in history, possibly roping in Europe and Russia becoming a World War III, even though, as I talk about in this video, I think a World War III is possible over the next couple decades, but I don't think it's the most likely option, with the most likely conflict being something like the 30 Years' War, or a series of proxy, indirect, long-form wars. Russia and China probably wouldn't win these conflicts. Every century we see the 20-year or so conflict where the land-based powers tries to challenge the sea-based one, and the sea-based one wins by building the strongest coalition, and this fits perfectly for this situation. At the same time, the Russians, who are the key Chinese ally, have performed really poorly in Ukraine. And as well as that, China's reaction to COVID and their latest lockdowns is also showing a lack of cohesion and corruption, probably weakening their military. And on top of that, Russia and China are both seeing collapsing populations. So in a conflict like this, I think the US would probably end up winning with its coalition. Afterwards, due to supply problems and the population collapses that would be bearing fruit, driven even further by more young people dying in wars and struggles, we would see much of Eurasia collapse into a horrifying warlord period. The worst part of this crisis would happen now, in next winter. If grain and agriculture goes as bad as is possible, Africa and the Middle East would have mass famine, killing tens of millions at least. Many people will try to flee across the Mediterranean to Europe, only to have Europe strongly turn against immigration and shoot migrant boats in the water. However, we would see state collapses in much of the area, with nations falling apart in Africa and the Middle East to be replaced by more primal organizations, normally built off ethnicity or religion, or the charisma of a great leader taking the fore. Politics becomes extremely polarized in the area that continues to function to a certain degree like the US, Western Europe, or India. You would probably see the government have trouble carrying out its orders, with, say, many cities in America being controlled by left-wing gangs, while right-wing militias would be skirmishing them in suburbs, while the government is unclear about what it should do lest it cause a civil war. However, over time in all of these areas, politics gradually switches to the right, as a reaction to the historically left-wing post-World War II order. The worst possible, but still out there option is these countries becoming military dictatorships. I make this sound horrible, and don't get me wrong, it is. However, I'd like to have the ending I normally have, that if we can get through this, it'll be worthwhile. Almost always, the greatest golden ages follow the worst struggles. The 50s couldn't exist without World War II, and the Augustan Golden Age after the Roman Civil War. I can tell you what will end, but I can't tell you what will come next. What kinds of music, economic innovations, and the like will come out of fruition of these struggles, as they always do. Chaos breeds order and vice versa, forming a beautiful nexus that is creation. And the fact that our times might see some of the greatest chaos will also mean we'll see some of the most beautiful creations of order afterwards. When you're old and telling your grandkids at how you spent your life, do you want to have been in the generation who fought in the world wars or who lived in the 80s? I can't offer you anything except glory and a story worth telling. What a feltist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pillar, Patreon, or Pearl. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a wonderful day. As a final note, be sure to check out Conflict of Nations, which is offering anyone who uses the link below 13,000 gold and a 1-month free premium subscription for free. The offer only stands for 30 days, so click it now and join the fight in Conflict of Nations.